The Smithsonian Faculty Fellowship Program represents a rewarding academic professional development opportunity for faculty at Montgomery College. The fellowships are a product of a unique collaboration between Montgomery College and the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. It's the first of its kind between the Smithsonian Institution and a community college.
David Lott has called two MC campuses home, having taught English composition and literature at the MC Rockville campus from 1992 to 2014, and now English language for academic purposes at the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus from 2014 to the present. Originally from New Jersey, he holds a BA in English from Williams College, an MA in American Studies from the University of Maryland, and an MA in the Teaching of Languages from the University of Southern Mississippi. Beyond the U.S., he has lived in the United Kingdom, Spain, and Puerto Rico. His areas of interest in research and writing include popular culture, poetry, and international education.
Okay, so as Mimi said, I teach in an area called ELAP at the college. ELAP stands for, go ahead, anybody want to guess? No, English Language, very good, Sarah, you're going to win a prize. English Language for Academic Purposes. We teach students whose first language is not English, and we're trying to get folks up to speed in skills such as reading, writing, and speaking, so that they can succeed at the credit level here at the college and beyond. So how did I put my Smithsonian Fellowship to use in the classroom? Well, first of all, what I did was modify a course. The course is called ELAR 980. And I think it was Allison was asking me earlier, what the heck is ELAR? So ELAR is English Language Academic Reading. So it's a reading course. And it's a reading course that is mid-level for our students. That is to say, sort of intermediate to advanced. What I did was modify this course mostly by changing the readings and also choosing a theme. So what I did with changing the readings was that I jettisoned the traditional textbooks. I felt like the textbooks in this course that I had used did not have so much authentic writing, but things sort of digested for the sake of the students. And so what I did was I thought, well, I'm going to use mostly, not exclusively, but mostly newspaper articles and editorials from the mainstream U.S. press that were published within the last 2 or 3 years. And I wanted a theme that somehow connected to democracy, of course, for the fellowship, but also a theme that I thought would be compelling. So the theme I chose here I call democratic or authoritarian. Now, why did I think that theme was going to be compelling? Well, first of all, my students at the Tacoma Park Silver Spring campus, generally speaking, will say to me if we're engaged in a discussion about the politics in their home countries, they'll say that they had lived at some point under a predominantly authoritarian regime. And not only that, but in many cases, the students who came to live in the U.S. did so in part so that they could experience a more democratic environment. On the other hand, I came at it from another angle, and that was as an American who has grown up here, spent most of my life here in the States. For me, I had always sort of taken my democracy for granted. And also I felt that in the last several years, things were getting, for me, I don't know, a little more authoritarian in some respects here with respect to my own government. So I thought it would be a compelling theme for these reasons. So what I want to do now, and by the way, this is a small group of my students. Last semester we had 20 students altogether in the class, but I assigned them in small groups to investigate different exhibits, and they sort of rotated around. This is the American Democracy exhibit at the Smithsonian American History Museum. An image that you've seen from some of my colleagues already, that background. Okay, so I thought I would give you a little bit of a flavor for the kinds of readings that we did and the kinds of discussions that we had. And then secondly, I'd like to share with you how I integrated the Smithsonian visit with the class and with these themes. So here is, wow, it worked. Here is an example of an article that I used last semester. It's from the New York Times, and you can see that it's approximately a year old now. And this has to do with the so-called travel ban. You can see from the title that they're talking about Supreme Court justices. They seem skeptical of the challenge to the ban. In other words, they seem ready to sort of let it go through, if you will. So what I want to do is just read very quickly this sentence, this passage from that article, and then give you an idea of how my students dealt with this with respect to democratic or authoritarian. So as it says here, a 15-month legal battle over President Trump's efforts to impose a ban on travel to the United States from several predominantly Muslim countries reached a final stage on Wednesday at the Supreme Court, with its 5-member conservative majority signaling it was ready to approve a revised version of the president's plan. Now, for me, when I first encountered this, I felt like there was some authoritarian kind of influence going on. However, I don't want to show my bias there, but what I said to students was, well, what do you think? Is this a case of more of a democratic process? Do you sense some authoritarianism here? And it was very interesting because I had one group of rather vocal students who said to me, look, and I'm paraphrasing here, they didn't actually say this, but essentially they said, we don't really think highly of the President of the US. However, they said, what you see here in a passage like this is actually quite democratic. And so I said, well, okay, that's your thesis. Can you support it? And they said, yeah, because you have a democratically elected leader, a leader who is following the protocol through the legal system. It's not like he's unilaterally imposing his own personal ideas and making that the policy for the country. They said not only that, they said, how do these Supreme Court judges get picked anyway? And I said, well, honestly, other elected leaders, democratically elected leaders, nominate them. Legislators from within the democracy have to pass judgment on the nominees. So they said, well, that sounds very democratic. And they said, not only that, these justices voted at the end of this. So that seems quite democratic. So I said, okay, that's very interesting. Then I had other students react to that, of course, as you will, in a classroom. And they said, well, wait a minute. We're talking here about Muslim countries, predominantly Muslim countries. Doesn't that single out a group? Isn't that sort of part of the authoritarian playbook, if you will, where you deny individual rights to a particular group, and in this case, in the name of national security or some perceived need for order. They said, hey, that's like authoritarianism 101. So I said, okay, well, two different ideas about that, very interesting, you know, we're discussing this kind of thing. And then I show them a different article, came out from the same newspaper the next day, and what we talk about is one of the dissenting opinions in that Supreme Court case. You have Justice Sotomayor, and again, I'll read this very quickly. I'll say, look, these are her words. The United States of America is a nation built upon the promise of religious liberty. Our founders honored that core promise by embedding the principle of religious neutrality in the First Amendment. And essentially in this article, in her dissent, Sotomayor is saying this is classic authoritarian stuff. You had a president during the campaign and afterwards essentially referring to this as a Muslim ban, and many times, and she quoted the president in her dissent a number of times. And so this clearly is much more in keeping with the second group of students that I described, what their thesis was. Excuse me, there's more to this, because later on in the same newspaper article, you have, so at the end of this same article where you read about Sotomayor's dissenting opinion, we also get to this part, and the students really, at least my students last semester in this course, didn't really know how to handle this. They didn't know enough about it, so we had to talk about it. But here's Sotomayor drew parallels between the decision, they're talking about the travel ban decision, and Korematsu versus United States, 1944 ruling that upheld the detention of Japanese Americans during World War II. So the students say, you know, how does that fit in? What's going on? What's happening in 1940s American history and Japanese Americans? What's happening here? So I have to lay some of the groundwork down. Luckily, I don't have to lay a lot of it down because, you know, soon we went to visit the Smithsonian, the American History Museum, and we see opportunities to understand the history even better. But basically, I say, look, this is a case where after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese military, the U.S. military in the United States rounded up thousands upon thousands of Japanese Americans and also Japanese nationals and put them in these incarceration camps for the duration of the war. Students' reaction typically is, well, I never knew that happened in the United States. And some also said, well, I didn't think that could happen in the United States, which is very enlightening. But then really, for me, the pièce de résistance, if you will, was the opportunity to take them to an exhibit about this, and a couple of my colleagues have already referred to this exhibit, and it's this exhibit at the American History Museum, and it's called Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans in World War II, and here, my students last semester could get a sense, a much better sense than I could deliver in the classroom, of the lived experience of being in these camps, these incarceration camps, during this period of time. By the way, the writing part, righting a wrong, refers to eventually the official apology and also redress payments that got started in the 1980s, so approximately 40 years after this experience in the camps. So at any rate, here are, and you can see obviously the picture here of the camp buildings, dwellings, and barbed wire. And so, you know, these people clearly are living, really, they're imprisoned for a long stretch. Particularly sad and frankly shameful period of American history, but one that's certainly brand new to at least last semester for all 20 of my students. So here is just a quick look at the same students you saw on my first slide, but here they are at the exhibit. And one of the things that is particularly rich, as you know, when you visit the Smithsonian, is that you have a look at the artifacts from a particular time, photographs, if possible, the text of historical interpretation provided by the Smithsonian staff, and all of these things together enabled my students to get a clearer idea of what this moment in history was like and what it was like to live in these camps. So for example, here is another group of my students, a different set of four, and behind them what you see is a military jacket. It's a military jacket worn by an American soldier of Japanese descent who served in the US military fighting on the Allies' side, even though his family and community were locked up in these camps. And it's a really rich opportunity to ask students, for example, do you think you could fight for a country that was treating you and your family and people who look like you essentially in this way? And so it leads to some lively debates. Now, you might say, okay, compelling theme, fascinating exhibit, but it's a reading class, and so the question becomes, okay, not only are you reading, the students are reading, but what kinds of skills, language skills, are they learning? What ways am I teaching which allows them to decode, in effect, the words on the page? In other words, this is all about theme and reading so far, but how about the local level, like at the word or the sentence level, which is an area that we also have to talk about? Well, the answer to that is I just blended the kinds of lessons that I would ordinarily teach into this class. However, I used the theme, this overarching theme of democratic or authoritarian in order to talk about language skills. For example, here at the exhibit, same exhibit now, they have a section called the language of incarceration. And what you'll notice on the left side, and I will take the word at the bottom, the phrase at the bottom, relocation center, as an example. These things that I've been referring to so far as prisons, as incarceration camps, originally in the 1940s, they referred to them as relocation centers. And then on the right side, where it says current term, these are the terms that historians since that time, little by little, have used. Now this opens up many opportunities for me to talk about language, word choice, dictionary skills, all kinds of things. Let me just give you some examples. So one thing is the idea of the word euphemism, which is a new term, or certainly was a new term for my students last semester. And so in let's look up in the dictionary what euphemism means, and to what side here is representing, where do you see euphemisms here? So that's useful. Lots of times my students think, oh, well, euphemisms, fun word, but 1940s. I said, well, we still have euphemisms. We still have euphemisms expressed in official government language as well. So these things are very, very useful for analyzing language. Another observation in terms of language is the idea of the academic word list. So one thing in the ELAP area that we're concerned about is that students get exposed specifically to the kind of vocabulary that they're going to see later in credit level courses. And there is a list of words that's been developed called the academic word list, where the words on the list are commonly used at the undergraduate and graduate level at multiple disciplines, not just English classes, for example. So I can say to my students, all right, here's this list. Find for me 5 of these words, and it's not necessarily the word itself, but it might be a root. For example, I mentioned relocation center, so I say, well, let's condense it just to locate, all right? So find for me 5 terms, using your dictionary, 5 terms here that are also on the academic word list, for example. Another thing I can play around with is suffixes that indicate parts of speech. So you can see from the top left, exclusion, so you have S-I-O-N, then you have T-I-O-N with evacuation, and then N-E-N-T. So you say, okay, well, what part of speech are those? Yeah, they're nouns. And notice that you're going to see repeated elsewhere in your reading those same noun endings, and it's important to know the function of the word as you're reading, even if you don't know the exact meaning of the word, it can be very helpful in your decoding process to know what part of speech it is. In addition to that, we do something called word families, where you take the word relocation, and I give them some more. I say locate, well located. So tell me some other words from the dictionary or from your own knowledge of the language, some other examples of terms from that word family. Also, what part of speech are they, okay, within that word family. So you can see here, once again, that students don't simply read the authentic texts, like authentic news articles about this theme, but you can pretty easily, at least in my experience, infuse these language lessons within the broader theme. If you're willing to work at it a little bit, and luckily the Smithsonian Fellowship gives us an opportunity and time that we can invest in preparing those kinds of supporting materials for our students. And then we'll say, back to the beginning, thank you for taking this little voyage of exploration with my 4 adventurers here. I should add probably that none of the students, and this is pretty typical, I think, of the students that we had, having talked to my colleagues about this, none of the students had ever been, my students had ever been to a museum, let alone a Smithsonian museum, just at no point in their experience. So it was a real eye-opener. Altogether, we looked at 5 different exhibits, and I wanted to give you a little taste of one of them, and that was the Writing a Rome exhibit. So once again, thank you for your time. You're in, those of you who are just starting out, you're in for a great time.